Officials are reportedly weighing sedition charges for 3 members of the Oath Keepers group who allegedly stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Donovan Crowell, Jessica Watkins, and Thomas Caldwell, seen here in video obtained by the New York Times, have already been charged with conspiring to obstruct the certification of Joe Biden's Electoral College victory. According to the Times, law enforcement officials have given senior officials in the Justice Department's National Security Division potential evidence that they gathered about the trio and an analysis of whether that evidence supported a sedition charge. But they stopped short of delivering a more formal prosecution memo or a draft of an indictment. The final decision of the charges will be left to Attorney General Merrick Garland, who was sworn in less than 2 weeks ago and has said the Capitol riot investigation is his top priority. If the Justice Department chooses to indict militia members with charges of conspiring to overthrow the government, they will have their work cut out for them. As the Times notes, the DOJ has not successfully prosecuted a sedition case in decades. Joining us now is Michael Schmidt, New York Times Washington correspondent and an MSNBC national security contributor, and Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel and an MSNBC legal analyst. Andrew, let me start with you, just because there's been so much analysis about sedition and how likely that charge actually is. How do you read the landscape?
I think the most important thing to edify your viewers is that although the statute is called the sedition statute, it covers a broad array of crimes. On the one hand, when you hear sedition, you think of the overthrow of the United States government, and the statute does cover that incredibly serious offense. But it also covers much lesser crimes, such as using force to obtain federal property or using force to hinder or prevent or delay federal authorities. Those are crimes that seem much narrower and more tailored to what happened on January 6th, such as committing a crime of using force to obtain federal property is something that many of us just saw on videotape on January 6th itself. So although it's called sedition, it really covers a broad array of offenses. So I could see that those so-called lesser crimes, although still serious, are ones that do seem to fit the statute.
Michael, it feels like the dawn of a new era in terms of prosecuting right-wing extremists. I know during the Trump years, there was a sort of unspoken agreement not to poke the bear, that perhaps some of these groups were not as aggressively targeted or investigated as they perhaps will be under Joe Biden. What's your expectation here in terms of what we might see in the coming weeks and months in terms of law enforcement, Justice Department, our agencies looking very closely and scrutinizing the actions and plans of these types of groups?
January 6th seems like a pivot point, a potential pivot point for the Justice Department. Maybe probably not as on the scale of 9/11, but maybe similarly. And in that respect, what I mean is that it looks like the Justice Department will refocus itself on a new, larger target. Now, that doesn't mean that they're still not going to look at international terrorism, but I think that they are going to throw their time and attention behind the problems of domestic terrorism in ways that we have not seen before. Certainly in the statements and the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration, in the statements from their Justice Department officials that went before Congress in the lead up to their confirmations coming in here, they have said that this is obviously a huge issue. These people expect to spend an enormous amount of time getting their hands around the issue. It is tricky. It comes with, civil liberties issues that, in terms of free speech, that all this will run up against. But in many ways, it feels like a potential pivot point, a real change at the Justice Department. And it's one thing to look at January 6th and see how aggressively the Justice Department proceeds there. But then looking beyond that, how will resources be allocated differently? What type of cases will be made going forward? Will we see more creative uses of prosecutions to go after these groups? Will there be push to deem some of these groups, terrorist organizations? There will be a lot of things that we'll have to assess and look at coming forward in the months and years to come to see how much of an impact January 6th had on the trajectory and the makeup of the American law enforcement approach to this.
Andrew, Michael brings up the very real fact, the reality that we're living in, which is, this is not just an investigation into terror. This is domestic terror. And that then runs into civil liberties questions. And I will add, political realities here. From an investigative standpoint, how tricky is it to navigate an investigation into domestic actors versus international actors, given the political schism that is happening in this country, which, of course, overlays a lot of this?
Well, those need to be sort of separated. One is the sort of politics of this, and I think that's where Merrick Garland is going to be key in keeping politics out of that equation. The second issue that you raised, though, is one that has to do with civil liberties. And just to be clear, those are concerns whether you're doing foreign terrorism or domestic terrorism. There's still issues that we dealt with, for instance, at the FBI to make sure that we are adhering to, for instance, the Fourth Amendment as it applies overseas. And there are obviously those issues as well domestically. But remember, what the DOJ is going to be looking at is conduct, not at speech. And it's going to be important to have leaders who are serious and responsible, like Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco, to make sure that people stay on the straight and narrow. But it is very important to prosecute domestic terrorism matters, regardless of whether it's happening on the right or the left. And the final point I'd make on this is it's somewhat ironic because the sedition memo that came out in September of 2020 was penned by the Barr Department of Justice in connection with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations over the summer. But now you're seeing a discussion of using the sedition statute in connection with a very different group trying to do very different things. And
that's an important point to make. But as we talk about divorcing this from politics, Michael, Roger Stone's name has cropped up in the last 24 hours as someone that the Oath Keepers were with late last year. Anytime Roger Stone is mentioned, it's hard to divorce politics from anything, is it not?
No, and obviously Roger Stone coming off just being prosecuted by the Justice Department, being commuted and pardoned by the president in the aftermath of that, he is certainly, as close a Trump ally as there is. His own conduct was prosecuted, his own conduct in relation to the 2016 election and how he just, misled investigators about that was prosecuted, and he was, held accountable for that. He got out of it because of the way the president dealt with him. He is a lightning rod in many ways, but I don't think that the Justice Department for any reason would, because of the political sensitivities of that, shy away, from going after anything related to him. They have been very open about including things related to him in court documents. Obviously, there were these people that were there to protect him at this event. And my guess is that their nets will be cast far and wide, and they'll look at his role and anyone else's role in any of this. I don't think they will run from the politics or the hot button issues of it. This is this is the most serious investigation they say they've had in decades.
Yeah, it's certain that if the Justice Department doesn't want to inject politics into it, Roger Stone may be hoping to inject politics into it. Andrew, we're hearing that plea deals could start as early as next week. What does that tell you about the pace of this investigation?
Frankly, nothing, because there's so many cases, and some of them are fairly low level, and those kinds of negotiations will happen with defense lawyers all the time. The real issue is whether there's a way to move up the chain and whether there's a conspiracy charge that can be brought against leaders who didn't necessarily participate on January 6th. But to quote Merrick Garland at his confirmation hearing, he's very concerned about these groups and what's behind them and looking at this in a bigger context. And so I think if we start hearing about plea deals that involve cooperation and it's cooperating up, that I think will be significant. But the mere fact of plea deals themselves is sort of a non-event.
Michael Schmidt and Andrew Weissman, thank you both for your time. Still ahead, draping themselves around Donald Trump, the latest crop of right-wing Republicans pledging their loyalty and hoping for that coveted endorsement. How